morning, Tri-Cities. It's 9 o'clock on Friday, and it's time for Coffee with Karl. I'm Karl Dye from TriDeck, and we have a great guest today. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Patrick Jones. He's the Executive Director of the Institute of Public Policy and Economic Analysis from Eastern Washington University. Good morning, Patrick. Good
morning, Karl. That's a mouthful. Sorry to have you say that.
That's okay. It's good practice for me. Well, Patrick, we've been talking about having you on for a long time, and we appreciate you joining us this morning. As you said before we went on, that it's been part of your regimen to come to the Tri-Cities maybe even every month and kind of give an update on the economic data that you and the Public Policy Institute put together, and then share with different community members down here. So with COVID, obviously, you haven't been able to make the trip, so we appreciate you joining us on Coffee with Karl. And that's what we're going to talk about today is the research that you guys do, and go through some slides that you prepared for us and talk about what's going on in the Tri-Cities. So appreciate your time up front.
You bet. No, it's great to be here, Karl. Thanks for having me.
You bet. Well, we'll kick it off as we always do with our mugs. And so I, this morning, picked our mug from Port of Benton. Port of Benton is one of our critical economic development partners at TriDeck. They have been doing some amazing work lately. They drafted and convened a large group of stakeholders in the Tri-Cities and regionally. They were awarded a cluster grant from the Washington Department of Commerce that relates to clean energy production and specifically supply chain development, really centered up around advanced nuclear, which obviously here in the Tri-Cities is near and dear to our hearts. But Port of Benton's a great partner for us. Wanted to give them a shout out. They did give us a mug, and so as we always said, we're pretty easy. If you give us a mug, we'll talk about you on Coffee with Karl. So that's my mug this morning, Patrick. Do you have a mug or coffee story you want to share with us?
No particular coffee story, but yeah, I do have a cup here, and I am just continually amazed at the number of coffee roasters in our communities. I'm sure that's the same in the Tri-Cities. It seems like every year one or two more pop up. So we've got a plethora of choices when it comes to good coffee.
That's definitely the case. It's I think, Patrick, you and I first met when I was up in Sandpoint, Idaho, if I recall. It's been a few years ago, and they have a company up there that actually manufactures coffee roasters, and it's kind of a niche. I would imagine that company and many others that are building coffee roasters, as you say, because it's such a growth in roasteries that's got to be a growing sector of the economy, maybe regionally, as we see it now.
Yeah, no, it's good to see that grow.
You bet. Well, let's get kicked off. Maybe before we jump into the slides, can you give us a little bit of background, Patrick, on the Institute and then the Community Trends websites that you guys maintain, and maybe give us that regional approach, and then talk a little bit more specifically. We'll jump into the slides on the Benton-Franklin Trends.
Very good. So the Institute's about 20 years old. It was started in 2002 by our president at the time to really bring the talents, or some of the talents, of the university to the region we serve. And just by way of background, after Spokane County, the Benton-Franklin counties are the largest pool of students for Eastern Washington University. So it would make sense that we have a project. In fact, we've had several projects in the Tri-Cities over the years. This particular one that I'm going to leverage off today is something that's been around since 2015, Benton-Franklin Trends. And it came about through the work that we'd done prior in Spokane, Walla Walla, and Wenatchee. And it also was supplemented by a federal grant that we received courtesy of our two senators, U.S. senators. And after a series of community meetings, I think that went on for at least a half a year. I think we had 8 different community meetings. We were able to arrive at the content that people wanted to see on Tri-Cities or Benton-Franklin Trends. So I just wanted to point out that what people see when they go to this website is something that wasn't chosen by us at Eastern, but it was actually a deliberative vote by a lot of subject experts in the Tri-Cities circa 2016. So what we aim to do is to provide something that's no cost to any viewer. It's maintained by our staff and very able students here on a daily basis, along with our other projects, our other sites. And in the end, Karl, what we aim to do is just facilitate decision-making by having quick information that's very, we think, the most valid information that is the most appropriate to the community. So that's a bit of the background.
That's awesome. And then I wanted to give a shout out. I believe, and you'll tell me if I'm wrong, but that you have some sponsors for the Benton-Franklin Trends, and
Correct.
You want to cover those, Patrick?
Yeah,
we're
so
always want to
blessed.
highlight those sponsorships for sure.
Yeah,
It's a critical part of, yeah.
Yeah, we have great sponsors, and I'm proud to say that higher ed has really stepped up as being major sponsors. Both CBC and WSU Tri-Cities. United Way of the Benton-Franklin County is also the next major sponsor. And then speaking of ports, in the Port of Benton, we have all the ports on board, giving a bit of a shoulder to the wheel of making everything turn here. And then it goes on down the line with various sponsors, including the Pacific Northwest National Lab, including the Greater Columbia ACH, including, who am I missing? I'd have to, when we go through the site itself, I can probably pick up the ones I'm forgetting, but we feel blessed. This is really a coalition.
Oh, that's great. Well, as we get into the data, I wanted to offer to everybody watching us on Zoom, if you have any questions for Patrick, you can ask it in the question and answer feature down below. If you're joining us on social media, you can ask your questions in the comment section, and then we'll do our best to work those questions into our discussion as we go through this. And I just wanted to recognize Eastern Washington University. You guys really do a great job. That's great data that, Benton-Franklin would be maybe the second largest population center that students come to Eastern from. And then always a big fan of the Big Sky Conference, and Eastern's really done some amazing stuff there. So
yeah, that's
wanted to
thank you.
You bet. Well, let's get into it. Tracy, if you could share some the first slides for it, and we'll walk through these one by one and talk about the data on each one.
So this is just a slide that I'd like to use as a stepping off point to go back into the site itself. But before I do, this is just a screenshot. You can see that there on the left-hand side, we have many different categories that start with demographics up in people and go all the way down to transportation. As I mentioned, I think there are over 180 different measures of life in the Tri-Cities, Greater Tri-Cities, because it is the two counties. What we typically do is show the two counties combined, which is probably what TriDec is most oriented toward, because I don't think you pick counties, but you look at the metro area as a whole. And then for most of the indicators, we're able to give the same piece of information at the county level. So Benton County's version, Franklin's County's version. And then for about 55 of the indicators, we are able to offer this for each of the Tri-Cities, for Richland, Kennewick, and Pasco. So that's really the overview of the structure of the site. Most of the data are annual, some are quarterly, such as sales tax data, permit data, and there are just a few that we can't get every year, so they're like every other year. But that's in a nutshell kind of what the data in general terms looks like, Karl.
Well, that's great. And we did already have not a question and answer, but Gary Spanner let us know that Moon Security, Mike Miller, who's one of our board members, is one of your sponsors as well. So we want to give a shout out to Moon Security for sure. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Gary.
Thank you, Gary. Yeah.
All right, let's go on to the next slide.
Okay, so what I think we're going to do here is I'm going to share my screen, and we'll go right to the site, and then we'll get back into the presentation. So
sounds good.
Let me do this, share my screen. Can y'all see this? My the website in full screen. Okay.
Yep.
So again, what you see here is people, agriculture, and agriculture has its own separate category because it is so key to the economy and the communities of Benton and Franklin counties. A bit on tourism. This is one of the smallest categories. A lot on economics, which we're going to talk about here shortly. A lot on education, which we're going to talk about. Some under the environment. A lot on health, which we aren't going to talk about today. Housing, we could talk about today, but I don't have any prepared remarks. Then public safety, and then transportation. So, you know, Tracy, why don't we just go ahead and then jump to, I'll stop sharing my screen and we'll go over a PowerPoint that I've developed for this presentation and give you a bit of demographics from this category and then stop and see if there are any questions for Karl or any questions for me, or if Karl has questions of me. So Tracy, let me stop sharing my screen and we will turn it over to you. Let me see here. I do not want to share, so don't share this. And under stop share. Okay, there you go. Tracy, can you run it from here? Thank you. Okay, so one of the phenomenal aspects of your community that I've come to appreciate since we've been working there since 2016 is just how fast you have grown. You have picked up since the turn of the millennium 120,000 people plus, and this is a much faster growth rate than you see in the United States. And if the black line, by the way, indicates the growth rate for the US, that typically has been 0.6 to 0.8%. The blue line is the growth rate for the greater Tri-Cities, and you can see that is well above the growth rate for the US. Typically, you have been growing in the last few years close to 2% per year, which may not sound like it's a lot, but it really is a lot. And I'll just say that this is the look in retrospect. But if we look to the future, the Office of Financial Management is actually predicting a gain of 50,000 people between now and 2030. That is also a very fast growth rate. In fact, Franklin County is predicted to stay as the fastest growing county in the state. Benton County will keep its position as largely the fourth or fifth most rapidly growing county in the state of Washington. And we are, by the way, a state that grows very fast. So this has lots of consequences, I think, for a variety of areas that TriDec looks at, certainly for business, for workforce, for education, for housing, for transportation. When you're growing that fast, you better make sure that you've got the infrastructure to catch up. So that's just a key demographic that I wanted you all to see. Any quick questions on that one?
Yeah, Patrick. So, you know, I mean, we're here. I'm still relatively new. Until somebody tells me I'm not the new guy, I'm going to keep on claiming that. But so we have some thoughts about why we're growing, or you know, what are some of those drivers. But from the data, you know, from your perspective, can you give us any insights that you see in the data? Like, what are some of the reasons that we're growing so fast, and what are those drivers?
Yeah, so you have a very unique position in terms of growth population. Most communities in the West, and certainly in the communities we cover in the state of Washington, grow through in-migration. Almost 70 to 90% is due to people moving in, and not due to an excess of births over deaths, what we call the natural rate. You are unique in the Tri-Cities in that you have people moving in a fairly healthy clip, but you also have a fairly strong natural rate of population growth. In other words, more births than deaths in a significant way. And that's just a fact of life right now, is that you've got a very young population. And so if I were to show you an indicator that median age, you have almost been off the charts when it comes to how youthful the community's age structure is. So it's the combination, generally speaking, Karl, of those two factors. Now, why are people moving in? That's a very interesting question. Typically, we in economics think that people move to follow jobs. And I would still say that's probably the predominant reason. But another reason they're moving in is because you're attracting, I think, more and more a bit of the retirement community due to a variety of reasons, which are all good.
Something that we talk about or wonder about, and I think this is a great question for you from a data point of view, but with the pandemic, obviously there's a huge increase in remote work. Some companies now are even saying that people can work remote into the future. There's no set time when they're going to come back to the office, if you will. Is there any data sets that help us track if we are, say, attracting remote workers? In some of the different numbers that we look at, Patrick, we see counties that people commute to that live in the Tri-Cities.
Right.
And ironically, in some of the data, King County is like our third highest county behind, Yakima and Walla Walla that are adjacent, but then King County's up there. So do you see any trends or any of the data that you look at that might give us some insight into remote workers?
Well, that's the same data I think that I've looked at, or what you've looked at, which is called the LEHD data, and it combines basically place of work and place of residence. And yeah, I think it's true. The problem with using that data set is it's really hard to get a historical series. So we don't know how different it is today than it was a year ago versus 5 years ago, because we haven't been taking snapshots of that particular data series. But I do think that's happening all over the United States. I would caution, though, people to think that it's huge. I think it's a pretty nascent, pretty small, but growing. And what the data that we have been able to look at nationally show that where the telecommuting is most prevalent is in the suburbs or outer suburbs of a large metro area. So, this might mean that people have moved from maybe downtown Seattle or downtown Portland to a suburb that's 20 to 30 miles away.
Okay.
But
more in the same MSA, generally, that's the trend more so than, yeah.
Correct. Because, the thought is you may need to get to a meeting in person. And how's that going to work out? I mean, could get kind of expensive over a period of time if you have to hop on a plane every other week or something. Yeah,
for sure. And then one more question. You talked about that we are seeing maybe some growth in the Tri-Cities in the retirement community, but I know there's other communities, within the region and maybe even ones that you guys look at for some of your trends data, that most of the population growth that they're seeing is actually maybe from retired folks. Can you give us some insights in how that shapes a region or a community's economy? Because you just talked about like how we actually have a really young demographic, and I think I've seen stuff where Generation Z is our biggest demographic group that we have in the Tri-Cities. Others are much older. Can you just talk about how does that affect your economy? How does it change economies when you get a kind of a big retirement population moving in?
Well, first of all, I don't know whether the 65 plus group is retired. So we have to keep that in mind. Up until COVID, we found that the age group 65 to 70 nationally was in the workforce, like to the tune of 15 to 20%. So it could be a sort of a soft retirement, a glide path to retirement, but it could be that the economy's labor force has benefited up until recently by having this demographic in its labor force. I mean, and whether that's more oriented towards full-time or part-time, I don't know, but just in a prior life, I'll know that I used to hire part-time people in their 60s for lots of reasons. And so that's one thing. But, and to your point, yes, you have a lower share of the 65 plus population than say Walla Walla. than say Wenatchee. Chelan County in particular has a fairly high demographic there. But to the degree that it has increased, and it has, you can see that on the trends. It's definitely going to change the mix of goods and services a bit. For example, healthcare is going to become increasingly important. And what we see in the data, in the labor data, is that there's been if you look at the most dramatic shift over the last decade or so in the sectors by growth, it is the healthcare sector. And so there's people aren't going to move to a place unless they know that there's going to be a landing spot for them when they need it health-wise. And so I think that's one key area. I think another area that we have to be cognizant of is, what's the dialogue then between the community and the public school system? Because these are folks who don't have a vested interest, biological interest in the success of the school system, and how are they going to vote on school levies? So that's a second point. A third point would be just what it does to the mix of housing, and this whole notion that boomers right now are on the cusp of retirement, and the question is, will they downsize? And there's some evidence to say that they haven't really downsized that much, but I think inexorably, or just it's unavoidable that there will be downsizing. And what does that mean in terms of the planning footprint for a community? I know the port of Kennewick is really looking at a sort of I don't want to call it a planned unit development, but definitely a different look at denser housing in the Tri-Cities. So those would be three areas, Karl, that I would think would be affected by that increase in the demographic, which is happening. Yeah.
Thank you. That's really good, good analysis. Let's go back, Tracy, if you would please, to our next slide, and we can keep on rolling.
So this is just for me, coming from Spokane, and probably for you, Karl, coming from originally Sandpoint, just a remarkable story. And this looks at the share of the population that is non-Caucasian. And you can see the blue, by the way, for those who haven't been on the site, is the signature color for the Tri-Cities or Benton-Franklin counties combined. And in this case, shades of black or gray is the US. And you can see that over the 15 or 12, 14 years depicted here, that the Tri-Cities has gone from about 32% of its population being non-Caucasian to the most recent data we have, which is from the census count of 2020, to being about 43%. So a gain of 10 percentage points in a short amount of time. This puts the Tri-Cities, as you can just see visually, at a point where it is more diverse than the United States as a whole. It doesn't say that the Tri-Cities is the most diverse of any community in the United States, but you are more diverse than the United States as a whole. And of course, where does this come from? I think we all know that. It comes from the Latino Hispanic community, which is about a third now, putting the two counties together, of the total population. And where at the start of this measurement period, it was a quarter. So you got from 0.25% to a third. And to me, this has profound implications, which I hope we'll have time to get into, for education and the workforce, because these, the folks who are in Latinx families have different circumstances by and large than the folks who are in Caucasian families. And of course, the same thing might apply to the other non-white populations. The second largest is Blacks, and the third largest is Asians. And there's quite a bit of difference in just their demographic profiles. But back to the Latinx population, this is increasingly the face of the Tri-Cities. And what implications does this have for 10 years out and 20 years out for the economy is something I just like to keep in front of people.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I'll just say again, coming from much less diverse communities, our family really appreciates that. I think it's a real strength of the Tri-Cities. I think it historically has been. Um, it's really a big driver for our economy. It's an important part, and I think Patrick, maybe open it up for your thoughts about this. But I think that the Latinx community here in the Tri-Cities offers us many opportunities for upskilling. Connecting with some of the training programs and education programs at CBC, right. WSU Tri-Cities, the skilled trade unions that we have here to look at those next generations, while they're in public school, connect with them, show them the opportunities, because, we have so many jobs that are getting ready to be replaced because of the retirement trend that you talk about with boomers, and just the organic growth in the number of jobs. we right. need a bigger trained workforce. And I think you've got some slides that talk about that at the end, but it's so critically important. I think this, like I say, the diversity in our community, the Latinx community, is a critical part in being able to, get to those future job numbers, and ultimately for everybody that's here, living in the American dream, right? Like better income, better household income for the next generation, which is true for all of us.
Yeah, no, I just want to thank you, Karl. I'm really happy to hear that, because my favorite magazine is The Economist, and they have pointed out on more than one occasion that we as a country should feel blessed to have this demographic, because they are so young, and they are in a position to really help the economy of the future and the workforce, obviously, the future. And there are, as I think we all know, there are societies, there are countries that are not in this position, where they're facing just declining demographics. And those are real problems. I'm thinking of Japan, I'm thinking of Italy. And there are parts of the United States that don't have this situation. And we can talk about New England, we can talk about the upper Midwest. So for the Tri-Cities to have this sort of blessing, what I would call a blessing of a future workforce, is pretty impressive. And I think it's important to recognize that Latinx communities typically like to see we all like to see our children come back to us, but I think Latinx communities are especially keen on seeing their children come back after they've been away. So if they grow up here and their jobs here, I think the odds are very, very high that they will come back. And so, that is something that I would hope that leaders in the Tri-Cities regard this as a big positive.
No, I know. We, from the Tridec perspective, we definitely do. It's just such a critical part of our community, and anything we can do to open up more opportunities for everybody in the community is obviously a big part of our mission, for sure. We did have a question that does relate to that, and you talked about the natural population growth, Patrick, on the last slide. But right. Is there, can you make cultural attributions? So does a lot of that natural growth come from the Latinx community, or can you track it? And then, yes. And then do you have a split on the in-migration versus the natural growth?
We do. Let me just take the second question first. We
okay.
do. Most recently, in the last 2 or 3 years, the split between natural growth and in-migration is 50-50.
Okay.
Which I think is a pretty good balance. As I said, in most communities in Washington State, it's more like 70-30, 80-20 in terms of in-migration. In terms of what we call demographers call natality or birth rates, yes, it is definitely true that there's a higher birth rate among the Latinx community than there is among the other populations nationwide, and certainly in the Tri-Cities.
All right, thank you. Let's see, Tracy, let's go on to the next slide, please.
Okay, now this was again one of the startling. I have learned so much about your community over the last 5 years. It just makes me smile, because we have 3 lines here that are representing, in a way, the culmination of economic statistics, which is what we earn. And we talk a lot about jobs, we talk a lot about employment, but if in the end, we don't earn that much. We want to pay attention to that. And in fact, in the Tri-Cities, the blue line, which is again your community, is earning more than the, not earning, but has higher incomes than the United States as a whole. And while this may not seem, because the green line, by the way, indicates that the Tri-Cities is below the state of Washington's median household income. I would just tell you that the number itself for 2019, and we're not going to have the 2020 numbers for quite a while, unfortunately, for people who care about this because of COVID. The survey that is used to provide these numbers really didn't succeed. And so we've been advised by census that you will not get 2020 numbers for household incomes. We'll have to wait till 2021. But if you look at those lines, you are the only community that has a higher median household income in Eastern Washington than the US. You compare it to Spokane, which you'd think would be the case. It is not the case. You have a median income of about 68 to 69,000 in 2019, which is pretty healthy. The median income for the state is considerably higher due to basically one county, King County. And, you know, in a way, it's an unfair comparison. But compared to all of Eastern Washington, you are heads and shoulders in terms of your income above the rest of the counties. And this largely reflects the kinds of jobs that you have and the jobs and what they pay those jobs, because there's three legs of the income stool, and the most important leg is wages and salaries. And your wages and salaries are also considerably higher on average than the rest of Eastern Washington. And of course, that's a reflection of where people work. And so, you know, you can just go back from income to looking at your sectors and why that is so important, kind of the work you all do at TriDec in attracting and retaining jobs. So, you know, I view this as a very good indicator for the Tri-Cities, and my suspicion is that you will keep this relationship where you will be above the national median, but below the US median, unless you convince Amazon to put a second satellite headquarters in the Tri-Cities.
It's a great point. I think we will have an increased Amazon presence. It won't be for the headquarters jobs. You know, Patrick, a question that we have, and we've tried to look at it a couple ways, and we know historically, and it's even part of TriDec's historic mission, is, you know, supporting the federal mission. Obviously, originally, when Hanford was focused on production, and now obviously Hanford Cleanup, Pacific Northwest National Lab, we're influenced by those federal, direct federal or director federal contract wages. And I think that kind of probably is one of the drivers that we are really blessed with here in the Tri-Cities. But any thoughts about that? Any other attribution, or, you know, is there any trend in the numbers that show that having these federally derived jobs raises the total wage scale for the rest of the community? Is there that influence?
Well, I think you'd have to go occupation by occupation to
Okay.
determine that. So just to take an example that we were talking about before we went live, you know, if some of the sort of traditionally low-paying jobs all of a sudden are getting competition from other low-paying, would have been traditionally low-paying jobs, then it just makes sense that wages are going to go up. I don't think that outside of the lab, there's a lot of non-lab firms that have those kind of occupations the lab has. So I don't know to what degree the relatively high salaries and wages at the lab are going to raise the overall wage for that particular sector, which is called scientific technical and professional services, by the way. However, you know, a lot of the federal jobs are engineering jobs, but they also involve construction. And when I was preparing for this, I wanted to look at your top 10 sectors. We're able, just because of simplicity of graphing, we're able to map just the top 5 sectors on a graph. So I said, well, what are the next 5 largest sectors? And believe it or not, construction is number 6. And your construction wages, the annual average wage last year was quite high, $70,000 for construction workers. And I can't help but think that is in part a reflection of a spillover from the construction jobs that are at Hanford. We've seen on the supply side, there hasn't been, since the Great Recession, a lot of new entrants into construction. And yet we've got a pretty robust demand for construction jobs, not just in the Tri-Cities, but now with the infrastructure bill that's passed, it's really going to be strongly in demand. So that's where I would say the presence of the federal activities is impacting the non-federal workforce.
Thank you. Hey, Tracy, can we go back to our slide? We'll get into the next one.
Okay, this is something that I hope you'll celebrate as a success. I mean, a lot of communities were facing challenges about 10 years ago, and this is looking at the graduation rate. In this case, the graduation rate within 5 years. And the way this is measured, by the way, is looking at a cohort that starts in, would have started in this case 5 years prior to the date you see on the legend, and then takes 5 years to graduate. And the number for the most recent data we have is for the graduating class of 2020. And if you were online, you could mouse over that and see that's about 85%. And so for all the school districts in the 2 counties, and you can see that that is now higher than the state average, which is about 83%. And if you go all the way back to when we can start the series, there's been a change in the methodology, so we can't go back any further than 2010, 2011. You would see that value is 75%. So you've picked up 10 percentage points in the course of about a decade. And that is really something to celebrate, because we're not going to get a transformation of lives in any community, let alone a community that has such a high component of migrants and Latinx community, if you don't get them to walk across the stage and pick up their diploma. So going from 75% to 85% in this short a period, I think is a wonderful achievement. And it hopefully will open a lot more doors to kids than 10 years ago. I know there's been lots of work on this, and if you want to drill down on the site, you can see by county and also by community, so Richland, Kennewick, Pasco, just where those gains have occurred. And there has been the gains have not been evenly distributed. There have been some really big successes. I'll just leave it at that and let you peruse this at your own after we're done with our session here.
Great. I think, Teresa, let's go to the next slide, because I think it ties in really well with this one.
Yeah.
Because I think you got a point here, Patrick. Yeah.
I do have a point, and this is really disconcerting to me. Not just as a person with a self-interest in higher education, but a person who really looks at the health of Eastern Washington as a whole economically. And so we've seen this very strong upward trend in high school graduation and completion, and yet we see a pretty strong downward trend if you were to draw a line through those 2 different blue bars in college going activity. Now, this is for the class, by the way. The most recent data is for the class of 2018. And how do we interpret this? This is the measure, the percentage of high school graduates who within the first year of graduation go on to either a 2-year or a 4-year institution. It doesn't have to be public. It doesn't have to be in state. This is a remarkable ability of our measurement system, because students now have unique identifiers that we can track when they leave high school. And if they end up going to let's say, a university on the East Coast, we will still know that they are enrolled in that first year someplace in the United States. So this is not just looking at those that go to CBC or those that go to WSU Tri-Cities, but those that go anywhere to a 2-year or 4-year degree. Now, probably in most cases, CBC is the 2-year degree, a 2-year school of choice for if the Tri-Cities is anything like the rest of the state, and I'm sure it is, for those who want to go to a 2-year school. And then you can just look, this is the dark blue component of that graph. And when you go and look at this on your own online, you can click off the rest of the graph and you can see that this is where the strongest decline in college going behavior has occurred, is in our community college. And I find this a puzzle because CBC is a very strong community college, as community colleges go. And as a matter of fact, as a state, we have been recognized nationally by having a very strong community college and technical system. So to see this percentage go down so rapidly is both puzzling and disconcerting. And I don't have too many answers here, but I have some possible suggestions why coming up. Before I go there though, and maybe there's some questions on this and some comments, the lighter blue bar is the percentage of the graduating seniors who go on to a 4-year. And that it's right now 14%, by the way, as is the percentage of kids who go on to a 2-year, 14%. So total 28%. And you can just look on the left-hand side of the graph and see a few years ago, that was total of 40%, close to 40%. So 40% down to, 28%, that's a big drop. But the share of kids who have gone on to a 4-year degree has been largely the same, about 14 or 15%. So I'll just stop there and see if there's any questions, and maybe people have thoughts about why we're not getting students going on in particular to a 2-year degree, for which there is a strong demand occupationally. I think we all know that there's a reward financially, wage-wise, if you get a 2-year degree, or if you get some exposure at the community college level.
I wonder, just looking at it, Patrick, if I know, on the community college level, they talk about their enrollment kind of is the opposite of the unemployment rate. Right. That, when unemployment rates drop, when economies are doing well, their enrollments go down. When you maybe go into a recessionary period, their enrollments go up. I wonder if there's part of that, because obviously 2008, when we were at that peak, was sort of the recession, although from what people told me, the recession didn't hit as hard in the Tri-Cities as maybe the rest of the Inland Empire. But, I wonder if that's part of the trend, because as you talked about, construction being number 6 in our top jobs, but a lot of those jobs that are having a lot of growth don't necessarily require, even a certificate or like an associate's degree. That there might be other training courses they could get into to qualify for that job. I wonder if that's, part of it.
No, I think that's a very good point. I should have mentioned that, Karl. You're absolutely right. I mean, when we used to model for internal purposes here, our shop at Eastern for enrollment projections, we would find that inverse relationship between community college enrollment and the strength of the economy. So I definitely think that's true. Having said that, you know, not every occupation in the future is going to allow you to just have a high school diploma.
Yeah, no, for sure. And that we did have a question too, asking if the numbers, because I think on the chart it said people enrolled in Washington 2-year and 4-year colleges, but do any of those numbers include enrollments in apprenticeships or other trade programs past high school?
That, yes,
Okay.
they do. Good point, and they do not. So if you have the trades with their apprenticeship programs, if you have sort of the Home Builders Association, if it has an apprenticeship program, that is not counted. But again, what we're seeing here, if we think that most high school graduates start some sort of post-secondary training relatively soon,
yeah,
you have 28%, which leaves you 72% not doing that.
Right.
And
Oh,
I'm sure, you know, some of those well-paying jobs that don't require a 2-year degree or an associate, are going sort of begging.
No, I think that's I think this is a really good discussion. We'll get in your slides. Just one more quick point on that is, you know, with looking at what the future jobs are and what, you know, does it take an associate's degree? Does it take a bachelor's degree? You know, how do you line that up? And even the data system that you talked about, Patrick, where we can actually see based on this unique identifier that a kid that graduates from high school in Washington, we kind of know where they go. Do we know how many of those recent high school graduates, you know, either aren't entering the workforce or some type of education or training program? Because I think that's something we always see in data sets is like, you know, there's a large percentage of people in the US, maybe predominantly male, that just kind of drop out. Like they don't go to work, they don't go to school, they don't get in a training program, they don't do anything. Is there anything in that tracking system that we can see that, or is that kind of another gap?
You know, that's a gap. We know that a certain percentage go to the military, a certain percentage go on missions, but you know, there's no data sharing agreements, excuse me, to the best of my knowledge with those institutions. And so it's just a data gap. I will point out, since you brought this up, you know, it's really not the focus of my work here, but there is a much higher percentage right now of high school graduates who are female that go on to 2- and 4-year degrees than males. Recently at Eastern, it's 60 to 40%. And, you know, the trend has only gotten stronger this way. And so I think what you're having is a sorting by sex of different kinds of occupations, because you will get different occupations if you don't go on to some sort of a post-secondary education.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, let's get back into the slides, Tracy, if we could, please, and we'll I know you've got some good stuff coming up. I don't want to cut you short on.
Yeah. So I just want to point out to the group that, you know, here are just some of my quick thoughts about why we're seeing this. And these are areas where I think the community could get involved. I'll just say that from my perspective as a parent and my perspective as a economist here at the Institute, that and interacting with school districts, that I don't think there's a big awareness of what the future forecasts of the job market say. And I think we need to get the word out that, to the best of our knowledge, here's what the labor economists at the Bureau of Labor Statistics or at Employment Security in Olympia are saying about the state, about the Tri-Cities. And, you know, just trying to get the point across that there are perhaps more opportunities than you see. We know that there are financial challenges, and one of them is FAFSA, the student financial aid. And we see actually very low FAFSA completion rates in Eastern Washington. And this has, I think, a bit to do with financial literacy, has a bit to do with the complexity of filling out those forms. But we know that there's lots of money out there for low-income students. Those are called Pell Grants. And yet we don't see as many of those low-income families filling out FAFSA. So that's one. Third is obviously cost. You know, we've all heard about the cost, rising cost of higher education, and what that means, in particular for the Latinx community and people of color, their families, where they may not have the same incomes as Caucasian families. Then there's this whole notion of expectations, and I think that these cultural values play a bigger role than we think. So those are just four thoughts I have about why we're not seeing more college going in the Tri-Cities. And some of you may have thoughts as well, but I do know our community foundation in Spokane is developing a challenge campaign that has its goal of providing basically tuition paid for promise to all Spokane County students who want to go to a 2 or 4 year school. The foundation is not there yet, but you know there are many places around the country that are doing this.
Is that the Innovia Foundation in Spokane, Patrick? Okay,
that's the Innovia, and since you worked with them, Karl, their hope is to start in Spokane and then go to northern Idaho.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. Tracy, can we go to the next slide and we'll just get through these, and we're down to about 9 minutes.
Right. So I just want to point out that, you know, even though we're not seeing a lot of college going activity, we do know through census that the share of people who have a bachelor's or higher degree is rising in the Tri-Cities. So the only thing we can conclude is that this is largely due to people who have come to the Tri-Cities with that degree, who weren't raised here and come back with that degree. So in other words, imported talent. So next slide, Tracy, and we'll go through these. So I just wanted to do this thought exercise just to sort of just underline just what's at stake here. So as I mentioned at the outset, OFM is expecting about 50,000 new residents over the next few years. And by another agency, Employment Security, is projecting that there will be every year, get this, 17,000 new jobs in the combined counties. Every year from 2025 to 2029, 17,000 new jobs posted. Now, most of those jobs are not going to be due to growth, but they're going to be due to retirement. And they're going to be due to people leaving their current occupation for another occupation. But we still need to fill that occupational slot. And the best I can eyeball the forecast I see coming out of the Tri-Cities is that about a third of these jobs will need to be jobs that require a bachelor's degree. So let's just say that's 5,500 a year is what will need to be filled every year in the Tri-Cities, jobs that take a bachelor's degree. Next slide, Tracy, and I'll finish up with just this little arithmetic. Okay, so unfortunately that those columns shifted on us when we went to this, but that should be one nice vertical column. And I'm estimating that we have about 4,200 kids graduating in 2030. That's an increase from 35 to 3,600 currently, just due to the population growth that we expect. And if we just take the small percentage that are going on directly to a 4-year, we're going to get about 600 students going to a 4-year degree. And we're going to get about 200 who go on to a 2-year school and then go on from a 2-year school to get a bachelor's degree. So you can see that's about 800 students. And if we assume that they all finish, which is a big assumption, and if we assume that they all come back, out of that 5,500 demand we see for occupations with a bachelor's degree, you're still going to be short most of your jobs. You're still going to be short 4,700 occupations. So I think that's a huge gauntlet to run for your economy in the next 10 years is where are you going to find this talent? And the next slide, I think, answers that question. You can import the talent, which is what I think has happened to a large degree. And we certainly want to see an economy that has lots of new blood and imported talent. But to what degree do you want to grow your own as well? And to what degree do you want to offer the opportunities of these high wages that you see in the Tri-Cities, or that are most likely to continue, to the kids who started at first grade at elementary school in the Pasco School District? So that's really how I'd like to leave this, is this challenge to think how we close this gap between a very strong future need for those with a occupation with a 4-year credential. And by the way, I could have done something similar for a 2-year credential, and it will probably be larger or certainly as big. So how do we get there?
Patrick, this is really, really great information. I think it's a good point. It's one that we've been talking about, during COVID here, because, it's not a traditional role historically of economic development, right? It's like economic development is just focused on the growth, whether our existing companies, let's help them grow, let's bring in new companies. But, this data that you're showing to us, which I think is really good, shows us our challenge, because like companies aren't going to stay here or come here in the future if we can't answer this question. And it's, as to your point, looking out to 2030, as it gets, 10 years out, it doesn't get any better based on the trends in the numbers that you're showing. But yet at the same time, we've got these really critical building blocks that are the potential, I think, for your second point, which is, kind of grow your own talent. We've got this young demographic. We've got kids that are coming through the public school system. And I think you hit on a couple of things that we're going to be working on next year. One is forecasting, to be able to work with all of our partners in the Tri-Cities and start to put a forecast, by industry cluster on what are our future workforce needs, and what kind of degree or certificate or apprenticeship or skilled trade or, union training program and membership do they need to be into to qualify for these jobs. And then, sit collectively with our education partners and say, how do we build these more robust pipelines, if you will, to meet this future challenge? But at the same time, to your point, we've got to continue to recruit talent, because we've got kind of the immediate need, we've got the longer term need, really, like you said, based on a lot of turnover and retirement. So how can we do both? Because this growth that we're having, to your earlier points, it's great. It's, we've, new rates of expansion and growth that we really enjoy in the Tri-Cities, but those rates of growth will stop if we don't kind of have the gas for the engine, right? Which is kind of the skilled workforce that we've been really blessed to have up to this point, or been able to attract it and build it. How do we keep like thinking about carbon free, I'll just say, how do we keep the fuel, let's just call it fuel in the tank, not the gas, but the fuel in the tank, to keep moving forward, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think not only for the Tri-Cities, but for most communities, you just have it more acutely because you're growing so fast. Yeah,
no, it's a really, really good point. Well, Patrick, it took us a long time to get you on, but we appreciate you hanging in there with us and this time together. This has been really great. And I think Tracy and I will work on maybe scheduling something regularly as you have some new data that comes out that we could give updates. Because I know it's really good for us to share this information, and it kind of helps us put a fine point on the work that we need to do in economic development, for sure. And we really appreciate your partnership with the Tri-Cities.
Yeah, well, it's been a pleasure to get to know your community. I grew up in Spokane, went to school in Walla Walla, but didn't know the Tri-Cities. And now I feel like I know, which is the second largest metro area in Eastern Washington. And it's been a real thrill to do that.
Yeah, I got a real quick question for you before we wrap up. Is in the state, are we the third or fourth largest metro? I've seen different numbers, but statewide, are we the third or fourth largest metro? And it's not a quiz. I don't know. I'm just asking.
You would be the fourth. You would be the fourth if we count Portland, Vancouver.
Okay, as one
metro area. You'd be number 4.
Okay, but if we cut Portland off of Vancouver, we might be the third.
Exactly.
Okay,
exactly. Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
It's good to know. Well, Patrick, any closing remarks? Really appreciate your time this morning.
No,
and again, we appreciate the partnership.
Yeah, this is fun. And I hope people on the line were able to see some new insights. And if you go online and you have questions, you can just get a hold of us real quickly and we'll get back to you.
Okay. Well, Patrick, thanks again for your time this morning. Thanks for all the work that you do for Benton and Franklin counties. And we'll definitely have you on again. Have a good weekend.
Okay. I'll keep my cut with Karl.
Okay. That sounds good. Thanks a lot.
See ya.
Okay.
Yeah, bye-bye.